Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Now this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. ASA, in my view, is one of the world's leading animal studies organisations. It works very hard to connect animal studies scholars to each other, to make us aware of opportunities, funding opportunities, calls for paper, and much more. So please think about supporting ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. You can support them in lots of different ways, but the main way you can support them is by becoming a member. Membership is just $50 Australian. You can also like them on Facebook, follow them on Facebook, and you can also think about attending their conference, which next year will take place, well that's 2019 I should say, will take place in New Zealand. So that's ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Now this episode of Knowing Animals is also brought to you by MC Pony. Have you been to MC Pony's website yet, Vegan Enthused? I was checking it out just this morning. Now, the MC Pony, aka Elizabeth Usher, is all about double-decade vegan at the moment. So have you listened to that track? It's new. I like it a lot. You know MC Pony, you know her work because you listen to this podcast and she does the intro music. So go to her website, check it out, have a listen to Double Decade Vegan and let me know what you think. That's MC Pony, Vegan Enthused. Now, before we get to our very special guest, I also want to just give a quick plug to the podcast Knowing Animals. Now, I put a lot of time and effort into this podcast, and if you listen to it and enjoy it, there are a couple of easy things you can do to support it. One is to tell other people about the podcast, so it'd be great to think that people are listening and enjoying and sharing. So you can tell people either by word of mouth or you can share it on social media. And another way you can help is by subscribing on iTunes or leaving a review on iTunes, because iTunes reigns supreme. So, there are a lot of lovely reviews there on iTunes. Lenny Lark wrote, "I love the Knowing Animals podcast. What an inspiring debate of animals, what an inspiring database of animal studies information." So thanks, Lenny. Everbiscuit said, "Incredibly compelling. Thank you for the challenging but accessible series." So guys, thank you so much for those reviews. That's just a couple of the reviews that are on iTunes. So if you're listening to this and enjoying it, why not be like these people I've just read out and leave a review? Okay, now let's get to the real stuff, the important stuff. This week, Knowing Animals is coming to you from beautiful Sheffield. A little bit rainy today, but still lovely. And I'm joined by Dr. John Miller. John is Senior Lecturer in 19th-Century Literature at the University of Sheffield. And today we're going to discuss John's article, In Vitro Meat, Power, Authenticity and Vegetarianism, which appeared in the journal Critical Animal Studies in 2012. Welcome to the podcast, John.
Thanks for having me on.
So, John, why this piece? What inspired it?
Well, I came to this material through the closing section of Erica Fudge's essay, Why It's Easy Being a Vegetarian. And I think Erica got that from Susan McHugh, who wrote an essay about in vitro meat in Margaret Atwood and in Oren Katz and Einat Zer. So that was how I became aware of the subject. And that time when I was working on this, which was 2011, you were starting to see a lot of kind of opinion pieces and newspaper articles about research into in vitro meat. So that was the kind of research context, and I was led to work on it, I suppose, largely by suspicion, because at that time it was heralded as this great utopian invention. It still got that atmosphere around it, and particularly there was a lot of rhetoric around it being vegetarian or vegan meat. And that seemed like a very interesting way of conceptualizing it and quite a problematic way of conceptualizing it. So I was interested in what in vitro meat tells us about human-animal relations, whether it enables us to think about human-animal relations differently, whether it's the same old stuff in different form. I was also attracted just to the kind of weirdness of it. So the idea of the semi-living flesh. I mean, what might it be like to relate to or live with semi-living creatures, if we can call them creatures? So that's what, I mean, I've developed quite a long relationship with In Vitro Meat now, and it's actually, I mean, this is, how many years? 7 years since I wrote it, 6 years since it's published. It's all changed since then. I think there's some things about this article I'd do differently, and the technical advancements have been quite significant in that period. And so I'm working on some more stuff about it at the moment. But yeah, headline news suspicion is what drew me to it.
So, John, for people who may not know, can you tell us what in vitro meat is?
It's meat without an animal. So what you do is you, I'll try and quote Mark Post, who's the godfather of In Vitro Meat. You poke a cow in the butt, that's his words, and then you get a sample of its flesh. And then you put that flesh in a laboratory cell culture, and then you grow it. And so he was able to do that to the extent that in 2013 he produced a burger that was meat in every sense. You know, it's kind of molecularly the same as meat you'd buy in a kind of supermarket or whatever, but it was made from an animal that hadn't been killed. So it's meat without suffering. It's meat with lower greenhouse gas emissions. It's meat without the same kind of effect on antibiotic resistance or freshwater footprint. So it's kind of like perfect meat. And there's all kinds of things that you could do about human health as well. You could engineer meat potentially that was far more beneficial for human health and have the kind of impact on cholesterol, for example. So it offers to solve all kinds of problems associated with conventional meat as it exists today.
Well, it sounds perfect, John.
It is. Interview over.
So why are you concerned about it?
Well, I was concerned initially because it's kind of pointless. I mean, massive amounts of money have been invested in it and continue to be invested in it. It's like the kind of holy grail of food science at the moment. But the point that was my jumping off point for this article was made by Erica Fudge in her essay, which is, we don't need in vitro meat to solve all the problems that it exists to solve. So the obvious point here is, you get all these benefits by switching to a vegan diet. So what does it tell us that we have to have all this money invested to create meat without killing animals when you could just, eat vegetables and pulses? We know that meat is not necessary. So there's something else clearly going on here. And this is quite well known that meat has this kind of remarkable cultural status, this enduring cultural status. Like a meal ain't a meal if it ain't got a dead animal in it. So it clearly speaks to that we can have meat and still exist in that cultural space, but without the ecological detriments. But it also does transform that cultural space as well. Because if we think of meat existing as an example of a kind of dominatory anthropocentrism, that doesn't quite work with in vitro meat in the same way. So it is a kind of limit point for discussions about meat-eating identity. And I was very interested in this essay in identity politics and how in vitro meat challenged dietary identity politics. And I think my argument was probably in a way naively utopian here, because what I wanted to do was to cling on to veganism and vegetarianism as representing some kind of marginality or kind of deviance or outsidership, which I liked. So it wasn't like being like normal. It's like being like abnormal and thinking about things differently and refusing your consent, not just to violence against animals, but possibly thinking about other violences as well. And if you have vegetarian or vegan meat that this promised to be, what does that mean about those kind of subject positions? Does it mean that we're just brought into the pale of kind of normal politics and we can exist happily with all the other kind of violences that are associated with kind of like meat eating? So that's why I really wanted to cling on to veganism and vegetarianism as being somehow different from meat eating subjectivities. I don't know if I really believe in that anymore. I don't know. But
so are you able to, do you feel comfortable now articulating the evolution of your thinking, or is it still embryonic?
I would say it's evolved and it's degenerated and it's re-evolving again. So I was at a conference just this week, and it was really weird because I was on a panel with Mark Post, the godfather of In Vitro Meat, and I spoke first and he spoke second, and it was interesting because it highlighted the difficulties of doing interdisciplinary research. Because even though we're working on exactly the same topic, it was very difficult to have a conversation. He was a very kind of welcoming and open guy, but he's obviously working on the hard science of it and doing kind of amazing work in that field. But my kind of suspicious, kind of vegan Marxist politics is like a world away from that, really. So that was a question about how my thinking's evolved. I mean, I can't make up my mind about it, because on the one hand it seems deliberately kind of awkward to refuse it when all the practical benefits are going to be increasingly clear, because it's going to come to market in 3 years, I'm told. Professor Post told me that. So if that has all the benefits that it's meant to have, i.e. reducing animal suffering, having significant effects in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, etc., why should I object to it on quite obscure points about kind of cultural politics that no one really cares about? I mean, what does that kind of say about me, really? I mean, so it's this work has caused me to have like a wider reflection on the role of the kind of work I do. Is kind of the kind of critical and literary animal studies useful to wider debates, or is it just this kind of elitist, bourgeois, redundant intellectual exercise? I think it probably is.
John.
But no, it's fine. I'm having an identity crisis in front of you. But that's fine. I like having an identity crisis. Because I think like having an identity crisis, we should all be having more of an identity crisis.
Right.
And this is, I see, is my role in this research, is to make people who didn't think they were having an identity crisis have an identity crisis by thinking about the subtle, complex value systems that are often occluded or hidden in this kind of work, or kind of writing about me in general. So if you're not having an identity crisis, you ought to have an identity crisis, because that's critical thinking, isn't it? That's where we begin to assess our place in the world and think deeply about human-animal relations and ideas of instrumentalization, which I think I've not mentioned, but that was a kind of an important part of where I came into this work, because it still focuses on animals as stuff what can be used. So, in an even more profound way than before. So cows are like information, genetic information, or pigs are, whatever the animal you're working is. You can just get a sample of it and then you grow it. And that doesn't feel like kind of like love or kind of equality or egalitarianism to me. So thinking about identity politics and the kind of subtler issues, I think, helps expose the unanalyzed suppositions behind this kind of biotechnological innovation.
John, can I ask you, do you have the same reservations about mock meats, for example?
Similar, not the same. So, Quorn and all of that stuff. I suppose the similarity would be in that they affirm the centrality of meat in the same way that in vitro meat does. So rather than just cooking your lentil stew or whatever, just to pluck a stereotype from the air, you have to have something that reproduces as closely as possible the experience, the form of that, which indicates that really you want to eat meat, but you just can't be, that there are reasons why you don't want to be. You kind of still like buying into the idea that meat is good, it's powerful, it's kind of masculine, or it's kind of natural, or all of these stereotypes. So certainly it has that in common. I mean, it's different because it's not made from animal substance, is it? Obviously there's egg in Quorn, but the vegan versions as well. So in vitro meat affirms meat's centrality in a far more profound and deeper level. So if you're a vegan or vegetarian and you decide to eat in vitro meat, that seems to me to be a further, much bigger leap than saying, I'm going to have a Quorn burger or whatever, because you are ingesting an animal's substance, which is a far more profound gesture of human-animal relations than ingesting something that looks a bit like something or tastes a bit like something that was made from an animal substance.
I mean, it's interesting because I quite enjoy, say, a vegan hot dog or something like that. Particularly, I think of it as like fun food. I think of it as maybe I'm down the pub and there's a vegan hot dog on offer, and I'm having a pint of beer. And to me, that there's something about socialising and cutting loose and not worrying about nutrition that I find quite appealing. But that said, I can't see myself eating in vitro meat. I can't imagine that scenario.
So why not?
Indeed, why not? Indeed. But, I mean, another kind of perspective is the suggestion that in vitro meat actually isn't for vegans.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's not. So Mark Post very interestingly said that. So he does a lot of work going around the world speaking to people about his work. And that's one of the things he said early on in his talk. You know, it isn't for vegans and vegetarians because they're not the problem in terms of the issues that he's concerned with. So absolutely. So when those initial articles, which you don't see so much of now from kind of 2010, 2011 about it being vegetarian meat, I mean, that they've faded into the background now because it is for meat eaters who want that kind of carnal hit and would feel disturbed by the idea of going vegan or vegetarian. I just don't fancy it or attached to the taste. So yeah, I guess in some sense, yeah, asking vegans or vegetarians about it, I mean, that doesn't really matter, except insofar as it's a really interesting philosophical question about what we mean by these kind of eating practices and how we think about them in relation to human-animal relations more broadly.
So have we solved the issue, John? Do we know why it's concerning or alarming? There
are many issues. So why it's concerning: instrumentalization reinforces the cultural hegemony of meat. That's two reasons why it's concerning. One, in which I think it's interesting, perhaps not concerning, is to do with how you might have an ethical relationship with an in vitro steak, which seems like a mad question. But Margaret Atwood's Oryx and Crake has got this like amazing scene where the chicky knobs are liberated by God's gardeners. So God's gardeners are the kind of like environmentalist action group in the novel, and chicky knobs are these in vitro chicken drumsticks, I guess. And the God's gardeners do this mad thing. They set the chicky knobs free, and the novel is in the voice of kind of news commentators saying, this is crazy. They've set the chicken knobs free. Where are they going to go? What are they going to do? So it's not like if you kind of set a beagle free from an experimentation centre or liberated a cow that was about to be killed. You could imagine it would run off into the fields and it would do animal stuff, and idealistically it would fulfill its kind of inner life, living in the woods or something, having been freed. But an in vitro steak or chicken, they wouldn't do that. So what is going on in the idea that you might want to free them? Obviously, it's sort of a joke, and it makes the God's gardeners a parody of animal activism, in that there's kind of no rationale for it. They're just guided by this knee-jerk refusal of animal protein, so they act without any rationality or thought. But I think the scene is written with pathos, that there's meant to be some sense that it might be a weird kind of emotional reaction you have with it. And this is what's interesting about it, that the liminal state as kind of a sub-organism or the semi-living. It's not conscious, we can be pretty sure of that, but it's kind of alive as well. So thinking about it ethically might be something like a weird kind of postmodern animism or something that offers respect to its origins, possibly, or to the idea of instrumentalization that it embodies. So you could see that scene as being much more complicated than it appears on the surface, in that it suggests that we might have relationships with semi-living organisms other than mere consumption. I'm not suggesting we keep them as a pet, though maybe we could keep them as pets. Would that be fun? Maybe not. I don't know. But anyway, the idea that it's a question about what we mean by life and what are the parameters or the limits of ethical considerability as well. Animal studies likes those kind of questions. I guess they're interesting questions as well. So yeah, that is not a concern, but something that interests me about it, and the weirdness of it, the kind of affective dimension of it, the ontological strangeness of this as yet uncategorized matter, because no one really knows what to call it. It's got many names: clean meat, cultured flesh, in vitro meat. But the name is still being formed.
So in practical terms, I think it's fair to assume that this is going to happen.
Yep.
So from the perspective of animal studies scholars and or vegans, what's the task now? Is it to watch it unfold and see how the non-vegan community responds, or to be wary of it perhaps having some unintended side consequence for human, non-human relations? Or
yeah, I think that the unintended consequence for human, non-human relations, that would be an interesting idea. I mean, one of the anxieties that's been voiced is that if in vitro meat comes to large-scale production, one of the effects of it is a kind of agricultural nostalgia. So rather than doing away with traditional meat animals, it actually makes them more valued in a sense. So it creates a reevaluation of kind of traditional forms of animal husbandry, which, that might be, for sure, that's going to be better ecologically. I mean, less animals, kind of less greenhouse gas emissions. It's a higher end product. I mean, it creates social anxieties as well. So I'm very interested in the way it's been represented in literary texts. One of the best literary texts about it is by Paul and Kornbluth from 1952. It's called The Space Merchants, and here you've got this divided society in which the poor eat in vitro meat and the rich eat real meat. So it's not the end of conventional meat, but it certainly does offer changes and reinvigorations of traditional ways of raising animals. So I think clearly that would interest vegans and animal studies scholars. Yeah, and I suppose it's part of a wider question about what the future of animals is. Do we need animals? What kinds of relationships might we have with animals in a kind of vastly ecologically denuded planet? I mean, what might we go about forming a new kind of activism in relation to that? None of these questions I know answers to, of course.
Goodness me, John. Well, hopefully everyone started their existential crisis.
Good, yes.
Now, John, I ask everyone who comes on the podcast to answer 5 quick questions. Mm-hmm. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Yes.
Okay. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
It's difficult, but I think I'm going to say Henry Stephen Salt, because I work in the 19th century, and when I was really getting involved with these kinds of issues, it was during my PhD, and I read a lot of his work and was really transformed by it.
Can you say that more slowly? Henry Salt?
Henry Stephen Salt. So he was a great pioneer of Victorian vegetarianism. Yeah. So he wrote this autobiography, 80 Years Among the Savages. Right. So he was a correspondent of Gandhi's. For example, he was a really significant animal activist and kind of social activist, as well as a literary scholar. Kind of in the 1880s and 1890s, he was most active.
Wonderful. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
I wrote animal stuff when I was an undergraduate. I'm not sure I'd dignify it with the name of scholarship, but so I suppose I would say my PhD was a pro-animal PhD, and that became my first book. So it's what I've always been drawn to.
Fantastic. If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Philip Armstrong.
Oh, that most people don't want to give me one. Well, there you go, Philip Armstrong.
Well, for me, when I was doing my PhD, it seemed to me that he invented literary animal studies. I mean, I think that's going a bit far. But I mean, his work was kind of amazing. He invented all kinds of ways of looking at things before other people did, like the phrase, I'm trying to stop myself quoting every time I write an essay, is thinking about how animals leave their tracks in texts. So that idea that literary texts are not just humanist artifacts but contain traces of animals, I think is like the premise of literary animal studies, really, and that's why I had no hesitation in answering that. Well,
shout out to Phil. He's hosting the ASA 2019 conference.
Oh, very good.
Yeah. What's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
It's hard to generalise about this, since many different kinds of academics do different things, but I'll answer that from the point of view of an English studies academic, which is what I am, and I think we're usually thought to be useless, and that I'm very happy with that. And that is exactly what we can do for animal studies, is that we suspend or pervert ideas about usefulness and ideas about value. So we're interested in kind of non-utilizable conceptions of value, like the sacred or the beautiful or the good. And I think that is a really important thing in this kind of terrifying neoliberal era, to focus on these really kind of old school ideas that thinking about these forms of values might be worthwhile.
There you go. So if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
Well, the inevitable answer is for there to be less harm. But I mean, that is a multitudinous thing, isn't it? So I don't know if I could compress that into one thing. I think, so change one thing about it. I suppose I would have to say that it would be not a doing thing but conceptualizing thing, changing the idea of difference, maybe, to stop believing that we are kind of hierarchically removed from other creatures and believe in kind of horizontal difference rather than vertical difference.
Fantastic. So, John, what are you working on next?
I'm finishing literary history of fur, and I'm also starting to write a book that's kind of a literary history of in vitro meat, from its first invention in the 1880s in Missouri by Mary Bradley Lane. There might be texts before that. Do let me know if they are. To its kind of presence in kind of postmodern sci-fi. So 2 book projects.
Oh, wonderful. So how can people find out more about your work?
Well, I don't do Twitter or any of that stuff, but I keep my university webpage relatively up to date with the kind of publications that I do. But there's the SHARC, the Sheffield Animal Studies Research Centre. I'm co-director of that with Alistair Cochrane and Bob Mackay, and we've got like Twitter and all that stuff. So check in with SHARC.
Yes, wonderful stuff happening at SHARC, University of Sheffield. Well, John, thank you so much for joining us for Knowing Animals.
Thank you very much.
And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Now, you can follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals, or you can follow me at so_s. You can like Knowing Animals on Facebook, and you can also follow Knowing Animals on Instagram. As I said at the top of the show, don't forget to leave a review on iTunes, because reviews make it easier for other people to find us. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.